Chapter 5. Raid. The electricity had gone off before James's room had warmed up, so he carried his duvet and pillows through to the living room and spent the evening snuggled up on the sofa, reading an out-of-date motorbike magazine by the dim glow of a portable gas lamp. He'd been asleep for several hours when he woke with a jolt and an eerie sense that something was up. "The boy's not in bed!" a man shouted angrily. The men were in the hallway just a few meters away. Hard to say how many. James realized that the sound of them kicking the front door in had woken him up. "Check the living room!" Vladimir shouted fiercely. James shuddered when he recognized the voice. This wasn't a burglary. Something had gone seriously wrong at the meeting. He threw off his duvet and spun towards the door that he knew would crash open at any second. The only light was a tiny glimmer through the curtains, and James felt blindly along the sideboard, desperate for some kind of weapon. He stopped when his hand touched the base of Boris's marble and glass cigar lighter. "Got him, boss!" one of Oberdon's henchmen shouted as he burst through the door and blasted powerful xenon torchlight in James's face. Boris and Isla were only supposed to be having a business meeting with Dennis Oberdon. Maybe their cover got blown? But James had to shut out the whys and wherefores and concentrate on not ending up in a cell facing an angry Vladimir Oberdon and his blow lamp. James charged into the light, clattering into his assailant as he swung the heavy cigar lighter and smashed it into the side of the man's skull. It was too dark to see if the first blow had knocked him cold, but the second left no room for doubt. James spotted a holster under the man's jacket and reached towards it, but found two men plucking him off the ground before he got hold of the gun. Each man tucked a hand under one of James's armpits and made the room shudder as they slammed his back against the wall. The larger man punched him in the stomach. "Keep him conscious!" Vladimir shouted from the kitchen. "He's our only link to those bastards!" The punch would have crumpled most grown men, but James had taken worse in combat training and surprised his attacker by kicking him in the balls. As his assailant doubled over and stumbled backwards into the coffee table, James reached out for the other man and grabbed his long hair. He quickly looped some hair around his wrist. The man threw a soft punch as James snapped his arm backwards. The hair pulled tight and the dude's neck crunched. He went down so fast that James barely managed to let go before going down on top of him. After a panicked breath, James ran forward to finish off the man who was trying to untangle himself from the coffee table. There was enough light from the abandoned torch for James to see him reach for his gun. James grabbed his wrist, twisted the pistol out of his grasp, and pulped the man's face by repeatedly smashing the barrel against the bridge of his nose. 3 down, 1 to go, James thought, backing up to the wall as he inspected the automatic pistol in his bloody left hand. He wasn't familiar with the type, but it looked like it was ready to shoot. Vladimir Oberdon shouted from the kitchen. "Mikhail, what's going on? Cuff the boy and start searching!" James only had seconds before the lack of a reply made Vladimir suspicious. He used them to shut off the torch and creep out into the hallway. "Mikhail?" Vladimir repeated, sounding a touch uneasy now. "Did he get away?" James crouched down low. A flickering light came through the kitchen doorway, suggesting that Vladimir was nosing around with a torch. "Have you got the boy or not?" James was tempted to throw a smart-ass line back at Vladimir, but he thought he'd leave the comebacks to Hollywood and let Vladimir stay confused. "Guys?" Oberdon said, with something in his voice that James had never heard before. Fear. Buoyed by Oberdon's discomfort, James crept right up to the kitchen door as Oberdon turned off his torch. James would have happily made a run for the front door, but he'd have to pass the kitchen to get there, and that would give Vladimir an easy shot at him. James considered backing up and jumping off the living room balcony, but they were 2 stories up, and even if he landed without injuring himself, he'd probably be spotted by the rent-a-cops who stood guard at the front of the building. As James crept closer to the kitchen door, he heard Vladimir whispering into his police radio. "This is VO1, requesting urgent assistance. All nearby units come to Brezhnev Apartments, flat 2/17. Searching for a boy aged 14 or 15, blonde hair, stocky build. Looks like he's taken out 3 officers already." James realised that he had to deal with Oberdin and get out of the building before he had half of Aero City's police force on his back. Judging by Oberdin's voice, James reckoned he was near the washing machine at the back of the room. He poked his arm through the doorway and fired 3 shots into the darkness. If Oberdin had kept still, James would have shot him in the chest. But Oberdin had also decided to take the offensive and was walking towards the door. As James's bullets ripped through the metal shell of the washing machine, he sensed Oberdin standing less than a metre away from him. James practically swallowed his tongue with fright, but he had his finger on the trigger and realised that whoever got the first shot in would win the duel. While Oberdin took aim, James fired, shooting Oberdin in the thigh from point-blank range. The force of the bullet knocked Oberdin backwards. James bundled on top and snatched Oberdin's gun before racing back to the living room. After checking that the other 3 men were still unconscious, James grabbed his trainers from in front of the couch and slipped them on. With the gun poised, he walked back into the hallway, trying to ignore Vladimir's moans as he put on his jacket and stepped through what remained of the front door. The corridor was pitch black, but as James reached the stairwell, he spotted torch beams and heard men with equipment jangling up the stairs. Back up. Returning to the apartment seemed like a bad idea, and James couldn't go down, so he took an instant decision and raced up the musty staircase to the top floor. The unlit 3rd floor corridor bought him time, but if Oberdin was still conscious and told the cops that he'd only just run out, they'd be onto him in seconds. James considered his options, none of which looked good. He could stay where he was and get caught. Going up on the roof would only buy an extra half minute, and if he knocked on any of the apartment doors, it was unlikely that anyone would let him in. His only realistic option was to run down the metal fire escape at the back of the building. But wouldn't the cops have it covered? However improbable escape seemed, James wasn't giving up. He just shot the chief of police, and the cops around here weren't big on human rights. If they got him in a cell, they'd torture him until they got answers. A blast of cold air hit James as he broke open the fire door. His haste almost cost him as his trainer glided across icy metal. There was a flurry of snow and a touch of light coming from the headlamps of the police cars parked at the front of the building. James looked down and couldn't see anyone about, but it was impossible to be sure. The night was as black as the cops' uniforms. The steps were in a tight spiral, and James moved as fast as he could, trying to keep his footsteps silent, with one freezing hand on the snowy railing and the other clutching his gun. He took another look when he got near the bottom, but there was still no sign of life, and he made it safely to the tarmac. James was in a parking lot, surrounded by cheap cars owned by the residents. Whilst little money had been spent on the upkeep of the Brezhnev apartments, the perimeter was well defended, and James realised that he'd have as much difficulty climbing out over the 4-metre-high spiked railings as kidnappers and thieves were supposed to have climbing in. But at least it was safer than being trapped in a corridor. There was plenty of space and plenty of cars to dive between if someone came after him. James felt nauseous as he crouched between a Nissan and a Volkswagen, trying to gather his thoughts. He glanced at his wrist and realised that his watch was still on the table back in the flat. There was one thought that he couldn't get out of his head. What could possibly have gone wrong at the meeting? Maybe Boris and Isla had blown their cover, Or maybe Dennis Oberdon had known they were MI5 all along. Maybe they'd unearthed one of the bugs he'd placed inside the house. But none of this quite rang true. Dennis was a smart man. He was used to the attentions of the world's intelligence agencies and would have dealt with the situation clinically. Vladimir turning up and kicking down doors in the middle of the night suggested that the Oberdons were angry about something that had taken them by surprise. James could mull over theories all night long, and he'd still be trapped inside this car park. He needed to escape first and think later. Although the adrenaline made it feel as if an age had passed since he'd woken up, James knew it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. And it was less than half that time since Vladimir had called for backup. The cops who guarded the gate had run up the stairs, and nobody had been covering the fire escape because there were no other cops in the area. At least, not yet. In a few minutes there would be cops all over the joint, but James reckoned he'd had a decent chance of making it through the front gates if he didn't hang about. As he sprang up, he heard a cop emerge at the top of the third-floor fire exit. He slipped over like James had almost done and yelled as he clonked down 7 steps. James ducked behind the parked cars as he raced towards the entrance gates. As usual, there were 2 ancient Russian-built cop cars parked outside the entrance, but Vladimir Oberdon's bulletproof Mercedes had been parked across the road to stop any vehicles from escaping. He emerged close to the headlamps of one police car and was relieved to find it empty, but a thuggish-looking driver was propped on the bonnet of the Merce, with a compact machine gun around his neck and a cigarette between his lips. It wasn't ideal, but James figured that 1 against 1, with surprise on his side, was about as good as the odds were likely to get. Aware that the cop who'd slipped down the steps would soon be on his tail, he crept around to the back of the police car and poked his head up over the boot. The driver looked spaced out, and James considered shooting him, grabbing his machine gun, and making off in the limo. But it would take time. His gun wasn't silenced, and with more police on the way, it could turn into a full-blown chase. Besides, there's a big difference between shooting your way out of a corner and going on the offensive, and James wasn't sure he had the heart to sneak up and shoot a man in the back. So while the driver dropped his cigarette and ground it under a highly polished shoe, James ducked behind his car, crossed the deserted street, and jogged stealthily into the blackness with only a trace of moonlight giving his position away. He crossed a stretch of paving that ran between 2 high-rise housing blocks. By the time he'd reached a stairwell at the rear, 3 police cars and an ambulance had parked outside the Brezhnev apartments, their flashing blue lights making quite a show in the powerless town. James decided to run towards the derelict area near the edge of Aero City. He could hide in one of the thousands of abandoned apartments that had once housed the city's factory workers. But first, he had to get in touch with the Cherub emergency desk and tell them what had happened. He reached inside his jacket, then patted down his jeans, and came to a horrible realization. His phone was still inside his school backpack, and his backpack was still inside flat 217.